Chapter 2. A Magic Box. If I were to stand in Times Square and proclaim, "I am the smartest man in New York," at best, I would be seen as a fool, and at worst, a madman. But if I put posters all over the city declaring I am the smartest man in New York, people would begin to believe. Before we broke down human persuasion in laboratories, both ideas seemed equally ridiculous. But science changed persuasion, and we now know the second works. Such an understanding was only the beginning. This kind of persuasion eliminated the need for good arguments, logic, and even evidence. Methods of influence could be tested in laboratories and adjusted meticulously to ensure their potency, then used on the world. The new methods relied on manipulating the emotions and instincts of people rather than appealing to their understanding. They called it propaganda. Armed with the new science of propaganda, doctors would prescribe cigarettes as though they were medicine. Germany would exterminate 6 million of its own people, and the United States would strip people of jobs and ban them from professions because of their political ideas. Science changed persuasion, and many ridiculous ideas have been effective since. William Stephenson. The Nature of Skyfall Events, published posthumously, 2019. November 1st, 1938, Germany. William Stephenson gestured to the speakers in the middle of the town square, then to the radio tower a block away. They installed these all over Germany. For the first time, common people could hear the Führer's voice and listen to his propaganda. Most small cities like this didn't even have electricity until it was installed to support these new devices. They'd never seen a record player, and only on occasion did they witness a car driving through their part of the world. The small German town was little more than a cluster of farms and a few shops surrounding a courthouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. Even in the center of the city, the stench of dung from the fields stung their nostrils. Stephenson crinkled his nose. When the radio came, and the voices of famous and important people spoke to them directly, the townspeople gathered in awe and wondered to listen to music, hear stories, and recent news. There was no word for radio in German, so they called it a magic box of sound. His short, crew-cut hair was dyed blonde to better blend in among the Germans. He ambled along the street with his assistant, careful to match their pace with that of the farmers and shopkeepers across the way, but quick enough that no locals could overhear his whispered English. And what the box told them to do was hate the Jews, spy on their neighbors, and prepare for the great and final war. Stephenson passed a window and caught his reflection on the glass. He plucked a single hair from his own head to examine the root, then glanced at his assistant. "We should dye your hair soon." Alan Wallace adjusted his glasses and massaged the red marks on his nose. He pulled a long curly strand from his head and studied the black color. "You have any statistics on the value of that?" Long Canadian winters and his tendency to spend all his time indoors left Alan thin and pale. His skin fit tight like he was slowly starving to death, giving him a skeletal appearance. His strange appearance matched his manner. In social situations, he came off as awkward, and he liked to ask, "What are the odds of that?" The combination of all these traits led his classmates to give him the nickname Odd, and it followed him into adulthood. He gestured with a tilt of his chin toward the speakers. "How long have they been here?" "The town records say 1935, but Nazi propaganda has changed over the years and become more sophisticated. The presence of the speakers alone doesn't effectively measure the impact." Alan stopped for a moment. "I'm thinking how, but you're wondering when." He glanced at the scientist for reassurance. Stephenson gave a nod. Alan looked more intently at the speakers. Recruiters claimed Alan was brilliant in a way that was hard to see and understand. If the world saw everything through blue-colored glasses, then Alan's were green. He saw patterns in behavior and logic no one else could. Stephenson had seen it in the lab. Now it was time to test it in the real world. The assistant watched the crowd around the radio.
It's exciting, isn't it? I mean, we are in Germany. The farthest I've ever been from Winnipeg was New York, and now we're on a totally different continent.
He rubbed his shoe through the grooves in the road.
Cobblestones. I'd only seen pictures before today.
A wide grin stretched across his face. "We're not here as tourists," Stephenson said. "We're here to work." Alan stammered his response.
I think that. I know that, and, well, I was listening.
He paused and took a deep breath.
You want to talk about the radio?
He looked at all the people gathered to listen.
Do you think that's why it's so effective? Because the radio is new?
Stephenson didn't respond. He knew the newness of the radio had less to do with its effectiveness than what was being said through it. He would show his assistant that with time. Stephenson had studied propaganda all over the world for almost a decade, and there was no better place to study it than Germany. He brought all his new assistants here. In this place, it seemed time had forgotten. They saw just how deep the Nazi propaganda penetrated. Here, assistants could learn from their own experience. The two scientists wove carefully through the people as they walked down the street. Nearly every step and ledge near the town square had someone sitting on it, as a multitude of people gathered to hear the radio. They brought whatever quiet jobs they could do with their hands. Some knitted or carved wood, while others patched shoes or sewed clothes. Even people only passing through would slow their pace to listen. Alan glanced around the square.
It can't reach everyone, though, right? I mean, all the small farms we pass to get here, there must be people who work them that almost never come into the city.
True, Stephenson said. Those who can't come to hear the stories hear them retold at night over dinner, or as they wait for sleep in their beds. I can arrange for us to have dinner at a farmhouse if you'd like to see it.
That's okay.
Alan smiled.
I can see it. I heard what you said, and I know that it means...
He paused, trying to disentangle his thoughts.
I believe you. It does make me wonder, though. What if we could find communities where Hitler hasn't installed radios? Then could we convince them to believe anything we want?
Stephenson shook his head. No. The assistant was falling into a classic pitfall of science. Stephenson scratched his cleanly shaven chin. Perhaps if a magic box showed up on my doorstep and told me to hate the Jews, I'd be inclined to listen. Or, he held up a finger for emphasis, maybe I'd decide that any box, magic or not, that told me to hate my fellow man was evil, and I'd destroy it. Alan nodded, his black curls bouncing.
I see what you mean.
Two boys sneaked behind the large black speakers and timidly touched the electrical cord. The bigger of the two held it a few inches from the ground and leaned his ear toward it.
This is where it comes from. The voices are in here.
His face had a blend of pride and yet disbelief at knowing more than his friend. No, actually. Stephenson spoke in almost perfect German and stepped behind them, pointing to the sky. The voices are in the air, all around you. This is just what lets them turn the radio on. The two boys' eyes widened, and their pupils danced as though they were trying to see the radio waves moving among the clouds. The small one asked,
How come we can't hear it without the radio?
Ah. Stephenson smiled and directed their attention to the metal tower the Nazis built. It's like a dog whistle. You can't hear it, just the dog. That tower catches the voices and music and turns them into something you can hear. The small one looked to his friend and back again.
If I climb it, could I hear them?
No, if you climb it, the only thing you will hear is your mother's scolding. The boys gazed at the ground and then left. They shook their heads as if they couldn't believe Stevenson's explanation, or perhaps they couldn't quite believe the wonders of their new world. Alan approached, his coat pulled tight against the chill air.
If we already know how Hitler's propaganda is so effective, why are we still studying it?
Stephenson frowned and stroked his chin for a moment. What makes you think we understand it?
Well,
the assistant's voice wavered and he took a step back.
I just thought, you explained it to me. The history of the magic box, that's why it works.
No. Stevenson's frown deepened. There was no data to show that the newness of the radio is what caused so many people to believe Hitler's propaganda. I explained what happened, not why it works. A burning bush told Moses to wipe out the Canaanites, and he listened. That's what happened, but that doesn't mean Moses listened because the voice came from a burning bush. He listened because he believed it to be the voice of God. See the difference? It's subtle but important. Stephenson paused for a moment. You've fallen into one of the fundamental flaws of truth, causal narrative. Alan paused.
I don't remember them teaching that in school.
No, you wouldn't, Stephenson said. I haven't published my paper on it yet, so it's not in your textbooks, but you've probably already witnessed it many times. The two Canadians continued to walk down the small town's street, looking for a place to sit. A wagon rattled noisily over the cobblestones. A strand of hay fell from it and was crushed by the wheel. Most vehicles moving through the streets were either pulled by people or animals. It was a stark difference from London or New York City, with their swarms of motor cars.
Okay, explain it to me, Alan said. I don't want to be a fool a second time.
Are you familiar with bleeding? Stephenson asked. The ancient medical practice of bleeding people to help them get better?
Of course.
Alan's head bobbed to indicate a slight confusion at the relevance of the question. Do you know where it comes from? Alan stopped walking as his eyebrows knitted together.
No, I don't.
I bet you think the whole idea of bleeding people is ridiculous. After all, it would only hurt and slow their recovery.
Exactly,
Alan replied. Polycythemia vera. Stephenson paused for a moment for the new word to sink in. It's a very rare medical condition where the body produces too much blood. Even today, with all our scientific advances, we treat those afflicted with it by bleeding them. It's the only thing that helps. Alan's face tensed in concentration. It was the discovery of polycythemia that helped us understand the history of bleeding. You see, among the writings of the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, he documented the symptoms of one of his patients. Swelling, fever, difficulty breathing, and blotching skin, almost like a rash. All the symptoms of someone with too much blood. Alan shoved his hands deep into his pockets as he started to mentally put the pieces together.
They bled him.
Stephenson nodded. Eventually, after trying many things, they bled him, and he got better. Every time the man got sick, they would bleed him, and he would get better. The two men had walked far enough away from the center of town that they found an open ledge to sit on. Stephenson gestured to it. Now, without an understanding of genetic disease, you can see how they started to treat those individual symptoms in other people the same way. If someone had swelling, they would bleed them. Fever, bleed them. Since most people get better on their own, most of the time, it appeared to work.
Wow, it has perfect reason.
Alan cleaned his glasses.
I never realized. Of course they reached that conclusion. It doesn't sound so silly now.
No, Stephenson said. This is the important part of the story. Polycythemia is a real disease, too much blood, and we really do treat it by bleeding people. However, the rest of the story, I simply made it up. It's fiction. Alan's lips parted. the disbelief spreading over his face in a wave.
I mean, Hippocrates.
Stephenson gestured for the man to be quiet. That's why I told you the story. You see, you're still trying to believe, even knowing it's not true because I used a causal narrative. I told you a story that made logical sense, connected you emotionally, and explained a real phenomenon you didn't understand. Even now, I bet in your head you think that's where bleeding comes from, a patient with polycythemia who was bled. Even now, you're still trying to believe parts of my story. Alan hung his head.
It's strange. I know I shouldn't, but it feels true.
He glanced up and nodded as the ideas merged in his mind.
You wanted me to see that it's human nature.
A brief smile crossed his lips.
It's like you said on the way here, the natural man is an enemy to science.
Stephenson patted the man's shoulder. That's why I tell the story. That's why I tell you about the radio, and it's why I bring everyone to this place. I know the power of the causal narrative, and as scientists, we must be aware of it. He pointed back at the town square. That's what's happening to them. Every story told on that radio, a Jew is the villain. The narrative has sunk deep into these people. We need to find a way to unravel it, to undo what has been done. Alan knitted his eyebrows together with a touch of confusion in his tone.
But you just explained it. We create our own causal narrative. Simple.
Stephenson shook his head. It's one thing to instill a belief of something people don't understand. It's an entirely different thing to change what they already believe. Besides, it took Hitler years to convince all these people. He bombards them daily. Did you know it's illegal to listen to foreign radio stations in Germany? People are executed for it. Stephenson glanced up at the radio tower. We will get one chance, maybe just a single day to change what they believe and to get them to act. After that, the Nazis will shut us down. They may even take it as a reason to start the war they're preparing for. We get one chance, and if we get it right.
And to do that, you need the science. Alan smiled, a self-satisfied pride in his eyes. You're trying to stop a war.
I am. I know what must be done. It's the how that escapes me. Stephenson pointed down a side street toward a shop, with a large yellow star painted sloppily over the door. Color dripped down into the wood's cracks like it was bleeding. The large front window was broken, and a young girl, no more than 12, swept the glass shards. A similar star clung to her coat. A cluster of men stood next to a garbage heap. They smoked and laughed. One with a thick, dark beard pulled a rotting apple from the pile and hurled it at the girl. It struck her in the back, then tumbled to the ground. Her entire body tensed on impact. Her head twitched as though she might disdain her attackers with a look, but she stopped herself. The rotting apple was swept into the dustpan along with the shards of glass. Stephenson gestured for his assistant to follow as he walked towards the damaged shop. He continued speaking English. The voices from the box teach everyone here to see Jews not as people, as their neighbor or coexistent human. Stephenson examined his own hands. They have hands just like ours, skin, eyes, and nose, and yet once they are marked with a star, these Germans no longer see another human. A house cat is a pet that is loved. A stray is a pest that is hunted and exterminated. He stopped near the girl and casually placed a hand on his assistant's shoulder to position him. Their backs formed a wall protecting the child from any more filth. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and started scribbling. Alan pointed.
What'd you notice?
Nothing. I just thought we should have a good excuse for standing here. Once the hecklers move on, so can we.
Shouldn't we help?
Stephenson frowned. Sadly, the science must come first. If we appear to be intervening directly, the people of this city will see us as sympathizers. They will hate us or be too afraid to be around us. They will cease to act naturally, and we can no longer study them.
Seems wrong, though. Alan took a deep breath and sighed. Letting grown men mistreat this girl, right? I mean, wrong. He huffed again. You know what I mean?
It is wrong, but the science must come first. Stephenson made a sweeping motion to the city. This entire country is rotting from the inside because Hitler and Goebbels mastered propaganda. With the use of the radio, they can reach every citizen. The people don't even need to be literate. They don't get to choose to buy it or not, like a newspaper. It's simply thrust on them through the magic black box the government has placed in every city, the places where they reach the most people. He's even subsidized the cost of radios. Now, more Germans can buy them. It's mind-altering propaganda like the world has never seen. The bearded German shouted, his voice gruff and aggressive. "Hey, you're ruining our game! Move!" Stephenson's body went rigid, and he clenched his jaw before turning. When he spoke, it was in a crisp, nearly perfect German with a Berlin accent, and with the overly loud volume he'd heard the Nazis use so often. "We are working. We are helping to build the Reich, and you are playing games at—" he checked his watch. 10 in the morning. And you think it is us that should move?" He stared hard at the three men. They hung their heads and averted their eyes. After a moment, they wandered off. The girl stopped sweeping and looked up at the two Canadians.
"Thank you,"
she said in German. Stephenson scanned both sides of the street. People heard the little girl offer her gratitude, and it threatened his work. He wanted to show the girl compassion, wanted her to know there were people in the world who didn't think she was some kind of monster. But he had nations of people to worry about. Choosing to interact with her could compromise this entire city and set his studies back. Perhaps even far enough that by the time he puzzled out how to end Hitler's influence, it would be too late. A sadness pricked inside him, and he frowned for a moment. She was just a child and wouldn't understand what would happen next. But if he were successful, she would have so many more bright and better days than this one. Stephenson held his notebook up closer to his face. "We do not talk to Jews." He winked and moved his notebook just enough to press a single finger to the center of his lips. She began to smile, and Stephenson made a stern face and gave a slight shake of his head. She looked down at the ground and headed inside. Stephenson let out a sigh. "That's why we shouldn't get involved. That single act could undo everything. The science must come first." He placed his hand on Alan's shoulder. "If we can put it together, then we can take it apart, and all this hate will end." He guided his assistant back to the main square and sat on the stoop of the courthouse. Several men stood smoking a stone's throw away. A few of them wore the red swastika of the Nazi political party on their arms. "Have you been listening to the radio as we moved about town?"
"No," Alan whispered. "I'm fluent, but it's not like English. I can't track two conversations, and the static of the radio alone makes it difficult to understand."
Stephenson nodded. "It's a radio play. This one is about a young milkmaid in the country who was raped, and they are trying to find the man responsible. Can you guess who the villain is?" Alan lit a cigarette.
"What are the odds it's a Jew?"
Stephenson nodded. "The villain is always a Jew. The rapists, the murderers, thieves, and corrupt leaders are always Jewish in these stories. The Nazis learned early on that the two things that captivate people's attention best are music and stories." He pointed to the sweeping girl's damaged shop. "The radio has been in this town for almost 4 years. Nearly every memory that girl has is a day filled with endless stories where she and people like her are monstrous and despicable. What do you think that does to a child's mind? He indicated everyone gathered to hear the radio. What do you think that does to people who don't really know any Jews, have no close association, or have never met one? The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of rubber wheels over cobblestone, followed by a loud, blaring horn. People scrambled out of the road for the coming parade of cars, all of them sleek and black, with silver-colored trim. Nazis. They stopped in the middle of the road, and a tall, powerful man with a thick black coat exited one of the vehicles and surveyed the scene. Stephenson only needed a glimpse of the man to know the sudden danger he and Alan were in. He grabbed Alan by the shoulder and shoved him down a side street, his voice urgent and demanding but also brief. "Hide."